Okay, so welcome and thank you everyone for being here at our final session. It's a great pleasure to introduce our final speaker, who's Greg Corrado. And I've known Greg for quite a while, actually. I first met him because we were students together at the Computational Vision course at Cold Spring Harbor some years ago. And he was quite a standout in the course. Actually, he was well known for being quite funny and did some quite a good number of practical jokes on the course organizers. And also was known for being asking really difficult and probing questions and being very insightful and kind of a forward thinker. So I think that will come through in his talk today. Google Brain Team, I guess that's the title?
Oh, the title's secret.
Okay, it has a secret title. And thank you very much for being here today, Greg.
Thank you. I'm really glad to be here today. This has been a wonderful conference. I actually changed the title of my talk after seeing all these great neuroscience talks to be "So You Call Yourself a Brain Team." So the team that I work for at Google is called the Google Brain Team, but it has basically nothing to do with brains. It's really artificial neural networks and deep learning. We got the name when it was just me, Jeff Dean, and Andrew Ng, and Andrew convinced us that nobody was going to buy this whole neural networks thing. We'd better call it something brain-related because it had so much more credibility in 2010. I'm going to define a little bit of common terminology here so that we're all using the same vocabulary as much as possible, because I think speakers have used some of these terms a little differently. My own background is that I got a PhD in neuroscience and then transitioned into machine learning and then accidentally happened onto deep neural networks. So the way that I'll use the term artificial intelligence is just the pursuit of trying to make machines that have the appearance of useful intelligence. Machine learning is really about making machines that learn either from their environment or from data. And it's really the intersection between these two, machines that learn to be intelligent, that we've seen so much growth. Now, deep learning is just a subset of machine learning from my point of view. And it's where a lot of today's kind of AI applications reside, but it really is strictly a subset of machine learning. And just to give you some concrete examples of how I interpret these various things, so IBM Deep Blue is the chess computer that they famously beat Garry Kasparov. It's clearly AI, but it doesn't really involve any learning, whereas the DeepMind AlphaGo program is basically entirely learned. It depends critically on deep learning, but it also is AI. There are some things that use machine learning and even deep learning that most people don't really think of as being very intelligent feeling. So for example, the ATM check readers that Jan and others helped put into machines in the 90s, most people don't, they work perfectly well, but most people don't really think of those things as AI. And it's great that we have one of the people who worked on the ATM stuff here and somebody who worked on AlphaGo. Do we have anybody from Deep Blue? Or Watson? Is there anybody from the original Jeopardy Watson? No, okay. Maybe we should try to get some of those people. And then robotics, yes?
So I was doing the checks and we thought we were doing AI.
You were, but it shrunk. It moved. The boundary moved on you. So robotics, this is always a problem. It's a moving target. So robotics, though, of course, is about making machines that move autonomously. But when you say robotics to people, they naturally think of something that's at the intersection of all of these things. There are finally some interesting things that are at the intersection of robotics and deep learning. So for example, is it not going to play? At Google, we have this farm of robots that are actually picking up little objects and using reinforcement learning to try to learn their own motion control systems. And then, of course, projects like self-driving car systems are even more ambitious. They're clearly robotic systems. They're self-moving, and they use learning in many cases. And I would argue that they are actually what should be called artificial intelligence. So that's finally something that's really at I think the first possible example of something that's really right at the center. I've drawn the dot deliberately huge so that I don't get in a fight with anyone about whether the most important thing in self-driving cars is the AI pieces that are not learned, the AI pieces that are learned but are not deep networks, or the deep networks themselves. There's genuine debate. The point is people just want these things to work, and they will use any technique from any of these three areas to make it work, and I actually think that that's very good. Now, one of the things about machine learning and its growth, which I find kind of humorous, is so this is a plot of Moore's law, the growth in transistors over time, and this is a plot of the number of papers on archive in machine learning. And you see that they have kind of a similar shape. Now, it might be that part of this is due to the increasing popularity of archive, but I actually do think that our ability to do machine learning is really being driven by how computation is growing. Deep learning, you can see it over roughly the same time scale, is something that is also grown kind of exponentially in its popularity. This is, again, sort of just an iffy metric. This is how many times people search for deep learning on Google search, and the term was only started to be used around here, but you can see that it's grown quite a bit. So what are these various pieces? So for now, for most of the rest of the talk, I'm just gonna focus on artificial intelligence and deep learning and their relationship to neuroscience. So if you missed it somehow, what deep learning is it's just a modern reincarnation of artificial neural networks. If you were cynical, you could even just call it a rebranding, but it's something that it's the things that have changed since we were doing these things in the 80s and 90s is that, yes, there are some new network architectures, there are some new training maths that people use, but the main thing that's changed is the scale of data and the scale of compute that's used, and all of a sudden that's made these things work. But compared to the kind of machine learning that we were doing before deep neural networks worked, the main thing that's valuable here is that these things operate on relatively raw heterogeneous data, and we don't have to do feature engineering. And I actually usually use this figure from a Jim DiCarlo paper that about the organization of cortices, of visual cortices, to try to explain the basics of how deep learning works, because it is neurally inspired. And here's a very accurate diagram of exactly how it works, which is that you're given an image, and then various decision makers use nonlinearities to look at pieces of this image and cascade decisions up to neurons later in the system. So that's kind of the relationship between people who call themselves practitioners of artificial intelligence and people who work on deep learning. So these are really the people that are interested in neural networks. But the point of this conference is to try to understand the interactions between these two communities and the communities of people who think of themselves as neuroscientists and people who think of themselves as psychologists or cognitive scientists. And a couple of days ago, David Heeger did a 1-bit version of this survey, but I'd really like to do the 2-bit version. So you're allowed multiple citizenship in as many of these nations as you like, but by a show of hands, who considers themselves a card-carrying neuroscientist? Oh, wow. Okay. All right. Who considers themselves a cognitive scientist? Okay, still pretty good. Who considers themselves someone who works with neural networks? So, like, let's say you can program backprop after 3 drinks. That's pretty good. And for artificial intelligence, those of us we've been in hiding for a long time. Who thinks they're into artificial intelligence? Okay. So what are we trying to do here? So I think the hopes are twofold. One is the idea that we should have trade between our nation states, that we should have ideas freely flowing and benefiting each other between these various areas. And the other idea that sometimes people talk about is they talk about unification, or maybe reunification, because of course all of these fields, they differentiated from each other. They were actually they all share a common lineage. In terms of trade, I think one of the things that's important to think about is ideas flowing between all of these. And I think that it's worth thinking about how well we've done in these various areas and how well we could do. So I think the relationships between neuroscience and psychology have been great. Neuroscience has certainly had a huge impact on how cognitive science is thought about, and vice versa, although I think it's biased in that direction. In deep neural networks, I think that the influence of deep neural networks on AI is so strong that it's actually caused quite an existential crisis. People don't know how to identify with this without identifying with this, but there is actually plenty of thinking and work in AI that is not deep deep learning. I don't think there's been very much information flow in the other direction, I have to say. And between psych and AI, I'm not so sure. AI has certainly taken a few things. I'm not really aware of anything that cognitive scientists have taken from classical AI and actually kept. But what we're most interested in, I think, given this community, is this possible interaction between artificial neural networks and biological neural networks. And so far, I don't really think it's going great, I have to say. So there are some ideas that have moved from real neuroscience to artificial neural networks, but I'll argue over the course of this talk that they're not that numerous. And so my response here is that this is kind of in a state of meh. Right? Yes, there's some stuff, but you kind of have to squint and really want to believe that the two things that are related. In terms of reunification, and I don't mean the fields coming together, but for example, them using common theories of like, for example, the really good artificial neural networks that are used in production actually being related to scientific hypotheses about how the brain worked. My answer at the beginning of this conference had been, no way. But over the course of this conference, I'm giving this a major upgrade from to meh. In all seriousness, this is a big difference. And the reason why I say that is that I actually feel like some of the work about trying to understand whether we can use deep neural networks and the ideas in that community to formulate crisp scientific hypotheses that are testable in neuroscience is a really exciting possibility. It's actually the possibility of some kind of theoretical unification, but it's still only small and I would say distant. Okay, so let me talk about what I think is in common and what the state of that is. So what are there commonalities in the computational primitives? So of course, these deep neural networks, they do have many commonalities. For example, their use of convolutional filter banks. We think that that's very biologically motivated, as well as normalization operators are very handy. But there's a lot of things that are different. Like you would not recognize this diagram and being like, oh yeah, no, that's definitely V4A. And I think one of the things that you can look at to really understand how big the gap here is just the kind of learning mechanisms that are even involved. So we have supervised learning, right, which is learning by example. We have unsupervised learning, which is learning by exposure to the raw data distribution. We have reinforcement learning, which is learning from right or wrong feedback. And we have transfer learning, which is learning one task, helping you learn another. And I would argue that these are all very, very important to real biological systems. And I would actually say that probably maybe these last three are the main, or at least as important as the first one to brains. But when you look at what's used in industrial setting, then I should say that this is just my impression, the distribution looks very different. Almost everything that actually works in practice in artificial intelligence and machine learning today is using supervised learning. There is cool research on these other things, but those ideas don't actually work well enough that anyone uses them for things that are practical, except in very small special cases where they're starting to eke something out. So this might change, but right now there's this huge chasm between the type of learning that we do in artificial systems and the type of learning that we think is important in biological systems. And there's been a lot of talk about this at this conference. For example, there's a great talk from Yashu about backprop or whether some variant of it could be used in the brain. Is it sufficiently biologically plausible? And I think that that's a very exciting conjecture and something that we should run down, but it's just not clear at this point. But one of the things that is great about the kind of systems that we have in artificial neural networks is that this is an experimentalist dream come true. You can measure anything as reproducibly as you want, and you can inspect anything about how the system works. And in some sense, I think that there's an opportunity here for studying artificial systems to help us learn how to study biological systems better. So for example, in artificial neural networks, we can look at anything in any individual neuron's activity. I don't care how many electrodes you have, Matteo, like this thing is still better. We can slice and dice this stuff any way that we want, and you can actually really discover some pretty interesting things about how these artificial systems have learned to see. So in the lower levels of these convolutional neural networks, you see the kind of edge detectors that you would expect. You go a little bit higher, you start seeing textures, and then you start seeing patterns. And if you scroll further to the left off the screen, these patterns start becoming parts. You know, like, I don't know, they're like wiggles and technical things and flowery stuff, and I guess that's like just like one pant. And then eventually you get to objects. You get to funny little dogs and ooh, puppies. And that's really great. And we don't have anything like this in neuroscience. We try, and for lower levels of the visual system, we're able to do this, but at higher levels, it's been actually very hard to figure out what the optimal stimuli are. And this is hard. I want to underscore that this is hard even for the artificial system. So this is our current best state of the art in 2017 and 2018 in the Google Brain team to understand what our networks are doing. But just 5 years ago, we worked very hard, and this was the best thing that we could do, was to say, oh, look, there's a neuron that likes cat faces, and it took a lot of work to get one crummy picture. So it is hard, and there's a lot of interesting math to do there. So the way that we do a lot of these things is that for example, we're starting with random stimuli and optimizing the stimulus in order to maximize the response of a single neuron. But there's actually a lot of subtlety here, and there's a lot of ways that you can get stuck. And that's part of what has made the techniques getting better and better. And you can pair that with looking at examples from the data set that are exciting to a particular neuron, and you can say, oh, look, it likes dogs, but then you can, have it trip out on what it likes about dogs and get a different sense about, well, is it really animal faces or its snouts? Does this neuron really like buildings, or is it kind of buildings and skies? Is this thing looking for clouds, or just looking for anything fluffy? And I think that that's really interesting. You can also do interesting variational experiments that would have been very hard to do with neuroscience. So if you just try to maximize once, you might say, oh, look, it seems like it's looking for eyes, but then you see, oh, well, these are other kinds of dog bits and dog parts. And maybe there was a hint of that in looking at the stimuli, like this is not a dog at all, as near as I can tell. But it does have this kind of curvy brown shape. You can also do things like actually jointly optimize for what multiple neurons are looking for, actually start looking at what the population is. So this is a stimulus that neuron 1 loves, this is a stimulus that neuron 2 loves, this is a stimulus that they both love, and that's really cool. You can also start to decompose how the world looks at various levels of abstraction. So at lower levels, this is kind of the artificial neural network view of the stimulus. And when in terms of understanding classifications, you can actually back through the representations with gradients and figure out, oh, I said this was a lemon, and that's because the yellow round blobby detector went crazy. And I also said vase, and that's because of these two partial detectors over there. If you like this stuff, and I hope you do, you should go to distill.pub. It's a website that has the articles that describe how we do all of this, and it actually has most of the code right now, and we'll soon hopefully have all of the code, so you can be doing this stuff yourself. Because I think that it allows us to improve on the kinds of architectures that we use to understand what they do. And I think that that's something that could be a lesson in neuroscience, either about what techniques you use or how it is that we go about trying to figure out what it is that the system is doing. And also, please stop saying that artificial neural networks are black boxes. Like, this is not a black box. It's a very colorful set of boxes, I assure you. Okay. So it's not a black box, but it does a lot of stuff, right? So you can get deep neural networks to do object recognition. You can get them to do speech recognition. Apple finally confessed that they were also doing this. We, of course, knew because it was working. It's how we do machine translation, and it's how you can do some of the fun stuff like image captioning. But you can also do a bunch of other things that are really useful. So right now, most of my research focuses on applying this kind of stuff in the medical domain. And so one of the things that we wanted to build was something that could screen for diabetic retinopathy, which is the world's fastest growing cause of preventable blindness. You take a picture of the retina, and this is what a healthy retina looks like, and a very sick retina starts having these little hemorrhages and things like this, and the classical computer vision approach would have been to try to build little detectors and a classifier, and that would have worked not so well. it did work, and there's actually an EU-approved algorithm that works that way, but it's not that great. But if you just take one of these convolutional neural networks and do transfer learning, this is one of the cases where transfer learning is important. This has been trained to do some, puppy recognizing task, but then you start feeding it eyeballs and ask it to predict the diagnoses as marked by professional physicians, so it is supervised learning, and also some other side predictors, you actually get something that's pretty great. You get something that has a sensitivity and specificity profile that is at least as good as the individual ophthalmologists who gave you the labels that helped you train the system. So these colored dots are our estimates of how individual ophthalmologists perform on a holdout data set, and then an evaluation of the curve of the trained model on that same data. And I don't think that the point isn't to make a big difference about whether or not it's better. The point is that it's something that is substitutable. It's pretty useful. But one of the things that's been even more surprising is, so this is about taking an existing diagnostic and automating it with machine learning. But machine learning can also do something else in medical imaging that's pretty cool, which is that it can create entirely new diagnostics. It can see things in images that people hadn't yet noticed were there. So for example, here's a picture of a retina, and I'm going to look at these retina, and I'm going to regress out the age of the patient. And I'm just using a deep neural network to do this. The blue and the red dots are two different data sets. This is their actual chronological age, if they were telling the truth. Stated chronological age, and then this is what the projected age is on their eye. And you're like, oh, okay, that's kind of interesting. But it gets weirder. So you can do age. You can also do stated gender. You can do their smoking status, their systolic blood pressure, their diastolic blood pressure, their BMI, their hemoglobin A1C levels. A bunch of weird stuff is visible in the retina because you're just looking at a whole bunch of vasculature and nervous tissue. And why bother regressing out all of these things, none of which ophthalmologists necessarily thought were very visible? It's because these things are all the components that go into the formulae that predict cardiovascular risk. So there's a real possibility that you can take a picture of the eye and build a system that can evaluate real cardiovascular risk better than current systems. So that's pretty exciting. You can also use it, this is a fun one. They figured out that you can use deep neural networks to find planets, to find stars that have planets, by sort of scrolling through all of their various changes in luminance, and a whole bunch of planets have now been discovered by using deep learning this way. You can, of course, use deep learning just as a tool within data science for neuroscience in particular. So we have a project trying to use deep neural networks in order to help automatically find the connectome from electron micrographs of real brains. So real brain, slice it up, put it in an electron microscope, and you would like to reconstruct the connectivity, but it's just too tedious for humans to do. But you can train a neural network, again using humans to label the data, to kind of do a flood fill to trace the neurons in the real biological nervous system and get a data set. So that's another way in which there's contact, but it's not in the unification way. It's the kind of, oh, I'll give you an idea that's helpful. But this whole set of things where we're going from an image to a label, this is a traditional strong suit for neural networks, right? I mean, this is what we were all doing in the quiet period, right? We had an image and we were trying to put a label. What about text processing? So much of the world is in text. And there's a lot of really good news there too. So using a trick that Joshua and company helped pilot, what you can do is you can actually try to represent strings or any tokens in an n-dimensional space that then the neural networks can operate on. And the good thing is you don't have to know anything about how these things should be plunked down in the space in advance. You can actually learn these representations too just by backpropagation. So the way this kind of thing works is that, let's say you have some sparse features like words in a sentence, you just look up a bunch of vectors, you concatenate those vectors, and then you feed them into a traditional deep neural network, and you do whatever it was that you were going to do. And then when you do gradient backpropagation, you're not only changing the weights, you're also changing what vectors are in this randomly initialized lookup table. And this is pretty interesting, and one of the things that I think is interesting is that this doesn't break biological plausibility at all, right? It really could be the case that when you hear a string, when you hear a word, you just start out with, okay, well, I'm going to have some random firing of activity when I hear that pattern of sounds, and then you could actually shape this vector in order to learn something. And one of the simplest ways to do this is you can just to make sure that these things work, Tomasz Mikolov developed this thing where what you can do is you can just guess the meaning of, you can learn the semantics of a single word by trying to predict which words are nearby it. So it's actually just a single layer artificial neural network in some space. And doing that, just by training on Wikipedia, you can discover that the most similar thing to tiger shark is bull shark, or actually, I'm sorry, maybe it was ocean white-tip shark, but they're all in the same neighborhood in this 500-dimensional space. So that's pretty cool, and one of the things is that this does seem like this is one of the connections back to cognitive science, which is this idea that you know what a word means by the company that it keeps. There's another idea from cognitive science, or I'm not sure whether we would say this is from psychology or what, because this idea from Rumelhart is kind of contemporaneous with when the split was starting to happen, which was the idea that maybe there was a representation of concepts that was geometrical, such that geometric transformations had some meaning semantically or syntactically, and you can actually show that that's the case. Okay, I'm going to zoom through a bunch of stuff because I'm running out of time and I want to show you some other stuff. Okay, machine translation totally works. It's great. TensorFlow is the open source library that we use for a lot of this stuff, and it's been very helpful. It's helped us with scaling, and one of the things that we want is we want to make it useful both for research and for production use, and we really want feedback. And it's had pretty good population and adoption relative to some of the other packages, and that's because we view this as a second generation thing. We had developers from all of these other packages working on this package in order to take the best from it. But it's also, deep neural networks is also changing the way that we compute. So we built at Google these custom silicon chips, the TPUs, and the first generation we only used for inference, but that was actually essential to getting AlphaGo to play in real time at a reasonable cost budget. The second generation is usable both for serving and for training, and you can stack these things up. Blaise showed this picture as well, but the scaling when you stack them is pretty great. So the red line is perfect in terms of how much flops you get as you scale them, and the blue lines are the observed scaling. And this is more than just for ImageNet. You can use this, for example, this is machine translation, which remember I told you worked. Now we can go from training this thing in 18 hours to training it in half an hour, and that's pretty cool. And we're not hoarding these things. These things are available. They're available for free to some researchers initially, but they're also going to be available for rent. But one of the things that this does is it unlocks something new, which is this idea of AutoML. And this is where it starts to get a little creepy or interesting. And so the idea is, well, you know, neural networks are all about recursion. We love recursion. We love meta. So let's use neural networks to build neural networks so that the neural networks will be better. That's the idea of AutoML. So for example, let's use reinforcement learning on a recurrent neural network in order to tailor the hyperparameters of a convolutional neural network. So what you do is you have a recurrent neural network that has this ability to emit a plan that describes a convolutional neural network. You train the convolutional neural network for a little while. You find out how well it does, and then you update using the reinforce algorithm what kinds of things the controller should output. And it actually does it sequentially. It's like, oh, how many filters? How big are the filters? What's their stride? What's the next filter? And miraculously, you can train this thing to work basically as well as the very best models on this super well-studied data set that anybody has ever been able to develop, and much better than some of the models that used to be big news. Now, the kind of network that it comes up with is kind of weird, right? This is not exactly what a human person would have done. Like, there are a lot of skip connections from the first level, from V1 or whatever. But you can also search for other things. You can search for activation functions. So this is a place where I would think that neuroscience could have played a really big role. But what we can do is we can search over the space of activation functions for our neural network using this recurrent neural network that sort of you can write down an activation function as a little graph and then have this recurrent neural network describe the graph as a little string. And then you give it some primitives. So the most popular activation function that we all use now is ReLU, right, which is just the max between 0 and 1. It's great. Everybody uses it in ResNet, in wide ResNet, in DenseNet. Everybody uses it everywhere. But here are a bunch of other formulae that the system started exploring and do pretty well. And some of these activation functions are, oh wait, I want to show this other one. Some of the activation functions are really kind of weird, but a few of them that are really good kind of make a little bit of sense. So this is one of the ones that that Kwok and company decided to study a little bit. He called it the swish activation function, which is really just x times some sigmoid of x. And this looks a little bit like ReLU, but it has a bunch of other weird properties. So for one thing, it's not monotonic. It's got an extra free parameter in it that describes this kind of shape, and beta equals 1 was actually an activation function that was in the literature but was not super popular. But as you move this activation function around, you can get different kinds of behavior. And it turns out that you can get really good performance using this other activation function, regardless of whether or not you tune the parameter, the extra parameter. If you do tune it, you get those kinds of values. And it makes things easier and faster to train. So if you can train and get better accuracy quicker. And one of the things, it also works for machine translation, I'll just say that again. And you can learn other kinds of architectures, and those architectures are a little funny, right? Like this is kind of the kind of natural approach that was taken in describing the inception neural network, but this is a way of sort of compactifying it and making it smaller. And this is kind of crazy. So here's a plot of the number of parameters of various convolutional neural networks all on the same data set, and you can see that the automated parameter search, it just always beats you. It can always get the same performance for less compute, or it can get use less compute to get the same performance. And if you think that parameters isn't the right metric, it also works for multiply adds. Okay, I'm basically going to stop there, but I want to say one final thing in closing, which is that sort of where are we at? Is it the case that we should think about these things as entirely separate fields that are just flying apart, and that the study of biological brains is a really important process, but engineering aircraft is fundamentally different. And I'd like to make a slight refinement of this, which is that I really think the conversation that we should be having is that about the relationship between general intelligence as we see it in the biological world and sort of the artificial general intelligence of science fiction, which I think is very far apart. But what I would say is the machine learning of today is this, right? It's a tool. It does one thing really, really well. If you want to pinch stuff, this thing is just way better than fingers. Now, and it works best when it's used in combinations with whole hands, and you're not worried about this thing taking over. Now, if you ask what's the machine learning of tomorrow, and this is my honest prediction for the next 10 years, is it's going to be this, which is way better, right? Like, it holds the pinchiness all on its own. It's very strong. It's very useful, but it's still very far, very, 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 very far from that. Okay, and I think we should keep working on this because I'd like to get this meh like up to like a ah. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. That was a fantastic talk. We have time for some questions.
So it's a great idea to use a learning system to build a learning system. And is Google having any idea of like using kind of evolution methods to evolve an AGI?
So the question is about evolutionary methods to optimization. We have been trying to use evolutionary approaches to try to build these to configure networks. We're doing plenty of research in that area. It hasn't worked. Currently, the using RNNs to just spit out a configuration file actually is working better than the evolutionary approach. But the final point that you said about trying to like evolve an AI, no, right? So there actually isn't an effort that has kind of anything like that structure. It's all about, well, because remember, it's about how do I get this pair of pliers to be like this pair of pliers. That's where most of the work is.
You said you work in a lot of medical deep learning. I was wondering, since a lot of medical data sets include both text and images combined, like radiologists would put a lot of text on their images.
Yeah.
Have you found ways to combine the two network structures to get better
results?
results?
Yeah. No, so combining the two network structures, it's really easy. It's like falling off a log easy. You can actually just build up a convolutional stack that studies the image, and then usually later in the pipeline, it works better. You just take Joshua's embedding trick and just have it like stick on the side somewhere, concatenate it with the rest of the data, and it all backprops through really nicely. So you can have this multiple branches at the top, the way Inception does, but you can also have multiple branches down at the bottom. And it just works because the chain rule is just true.
I think a question right there.
Hi, I'm going to say something about the link between the coxi and the machine learning and AI that was kind of left alone and sad. So it seems like one of the things that general intelligence does well is it finds shortcuts and heuristics and cheats, and it is reflected in human behavior in a variety of controlled tasks. And one of the things that either AI or DNNs could do in order to optimize some of their general intelligence strategies to hold the sort of the pincher themselves would be to imitate that behavior by finding the representations that are good for that. They're not optimal for a problem, but they are optimal for solving the problem the way humans do. So human behavior, I feel like, was a little missing here, or animal behavior for that matter. What do you think is the role of that for finding representations that find flexible solutions that are heuristic?
Yes. So one of the things that's obviously very important to primate learners in particular is learning through mimicry. It's clear that it's something that we do very well and is an important part of how we gain knowledge so quickly. And there are people that are working on trying to have, for example, robotic systems that learn through mimicry. And I think that there's some real potential there of learning through that kind of transfer. I will say, though, that in terms of finding shortcuts, artificial neural networks are every bit, they're actually just as shortcut driven as biological systems. So like I used to train, monkeys, and the monkey just wants the juice. And if there's a bug in your task, they will find some way to get the juice, and they don't care. They just want the juice. The same thing is true with the artificial neural networks. They just want the reward. They just want the gradient to be 0, and they'll do anything. We've actually had, for example, in the if you accidentally label only the hard cases but fail to label the really easy cases, it will just ignore the easy cases and only do the hard ones. Code just does what you say, not what you meant, and that's a problem.
Like using the color of the sky to classify tanks. For
exactly,
example.
exactly.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. Back to visualization techniques. So how do you think, is it possible to visualize and produce 2D image to explain that latent concept which drives some particular neuron? If you think it's possible, how well this picture will reflect this concept?
Yeah, so we definitely can find, for example, what some particular convolutional filter bank really likes, right? What kinds of stimuli, and in some sense, this is a very peak activation. This stimulus is something that it really likes, but there are some methods to actually also estimate a little bit the width, that you can get other samples nearby of other kinds of things that are adjacent, that are also liked. And I think that it's pretty cool that you can kind of see, well, this filter, even after all of that math and the sometimes very weird combination of operators, these are the kinds of stimuli that really drive it. And you can actually back out, well, how did that driving these stimuli, how did it affect the final behavior? How did it affect the decision? And I think that this last piece that Chris has just figured out in the last few months is one of the things that makes it really nifty, and is that in some sense we can finally, at least in the artificial system, go all the way from stimulus to behavior and reason about why it actually did something through the very colorful, totally not black boxes.
I had a follow-up question about that, actually. It looked from maybe your previous slide that it didn't take that many steps to find those stimuli. Do you have any tricks for searching the space efficiently to find what the other stimuli? Yeah. It's you basically have to read the code. But the code is published. So it's quite complicated to get these things to work well. And so for example, priors are super important. Yeah.
If you just search in the entire pixel space,
you'll
get something that's pretty far from the manifold of natural images. So you have to do a lot of gymnastics to get these things to work, but these stimuli really do drive the networks hard. And this is, of course, very much related to the adversarial networks. So that one was only 2048 iterations, but there's a lot of compute in deciding how to change the stimulus, what that delta is. It's actually kind of a lot of flops.
So I think we have to stop there and go to the next talk. So let's thank Greg again. Fantastic talk.